Let me first say that it's a great pleasure to be here with you, and I must also thank Dr. Silva for inviting me. Now, as you know, central banks are all about stability, and I start every speech by saying that when I get a captive audience in front of me, I can't resist the temptation to tell you a little bit about how stable or not the macroeconomic fundamentals of the country are. So let me give you a very quick little blast on the macroeconomic conditions. And I think it's fair to say that despite the shock in the fourth quarter of last year through the political system, despite the heinous events of April, the underlying fundamentals of the economy are in reasonable shape. In fact, one of the reasons why we've been able to go through these two major shocks without a major crisis is because the fundamentals have been okay. Now, you probably heard me say this again and again, but I expect when you read the papers tomorrow morning, you will get independent validation that the underlying fundamentals are not so bad at all. I say the underlying fundamentals are not so bad because one, inflation as the key indicator of domestic stability is at the bottom of our target range of 4 to 6%. And if you take the current account deficit and reserves as indicators of external viability, then the current account deficit this year, despite the hit to the tourism sector and other activities through the events in April, we expect the current account deficit to be about 2.6% of GDP. It was 3.2% last year, and the 2.6 we feel we can finance without too much difficulty. And the reserves are at present about $7.7 billion US dollars, which is about 4.5 months of import cover, which again is reasonable. So all in all, you know, the macro fundamentals, despite all these shocks that we've experienced over the last 6-7 months, are in okay shape. They're not wonderful, but they're certainly reasonable. Where there is a challenge is on the growth front. Our growth is subdued at about 3%. The central bank thinks that the potential growth rate is 5%, so we need to get that up. But we need to get that up not through artificially pumping up growth, as we tend to do through inappropriate macroeconomic policies. That is what we've done in the past. We create sugar highs by either loosening monetary policy or having expansionary fiscal policies or having both. This time I hope we can avoid that. But the way to get growth up is by strengthening the growth framework through structural reforms. And trade policy is a critical part of that narrative. As a country with 21 million people, you know, external demand has to play a major role in terms of sustaining an accelerated growth trajectory. And structural reforms, particularly those related to trade policy, are crucial. Now, before I go any further, I must acknowledge the assistance I've got from my colleagues in the Economic Research Department who've put together some material for me. I've been asked to speak on both global trends and global issues, as well as issues related to trade policy in Sri Lanka. So I'll start with the global dimension, if I may. And according to the World Trade Outlook released in April 2019, global trade is expected to face strong headwinds in 2019 and 2020 after growing more slowly than expected in 2018. This is attributable to rising trade tensions and increased economic uncertainty. Global trade in 2019 is being affected by several factors, including new tariffs and retaliatory measures affecting widely traded goods, weaker global economic growth, volatility in financial markets, and fragile monetary conditions in developed countries. Merchandise trade is projected to rebound and grow by 3% in 2020. However, trade tensions could pose risk to the forecast next year. A study by the WTO attempted to quantify the medium-term economic impact of a wider trade conflict, in which international cooperation on tariffs breaks down completely and all countries set tariffs unilaterally. Such a worst-case scenario would lead to a reduction in world GDP in 2022 of about 2% and a reduction in global trade of about 17% compared to baseline projections. For comparison, global GDP also declined by 2%, and global trade declined by less, by 12% in 2009, following the global financial crisis. So that will be a major, major shock. Now, let me turn to some issues related to the multilateral trading system. And first, WTO reforms. A robust, rule-based multilateral trading system serves the interests of small and vulnerable countries best. It gives them greater protection against pressures brought about by more powerful countries pursuing their national interests. However, policymakers should jointly address the gaps that exist in the current system. Mr. Stark spoke at length about some of this, that exists in the current system, and strengthen the rule-based multilateral trading system, including by ensuring continued enforcement of existing WTO rules through a well-functioning WTO dispute settlement system, resolving the deadlock over its appellate body, modernizing WTO rules to encompass areas such as digital services, subsidies, and technology transfer, and also advancing negotiations in new areas such as digital trade. The need for structural reforms in the WTO, as Mr. Stark again spoke on this, has been long overdue. The WTO seems to have failed to deliver the pro-development changes promised for many years. Developing countries could be further sidelined by the narrowing economic and political interests of global powers. The Doha Development Round was launched in the aftermath of 9/11 and was expected to provide a boost to global sentiment and confidence. The word development quickly fell out of favor, and the initial promises were ignored at a very early stage indeed. The waning of the role of the WTO and the erosion of commitment to multilateralism more generally is a major concern, particularly for smaller countries. Now, with multilateralism and the WTO waning, there has been increasing salience in terms of bilateral and regional trade agreements. Bilateral and regional trade agreements have increased considerably in number and in terms of economic relevance. Such agreements substantially affect global trade, since the reorganization of flows of goods and services has a prominent impact not only on the contracting countries' economies, but also on other parties that are directly or indirectly engaged in trade with these countries. This trade diversion leads to suboptimal trading patterns, which have a negative impact on investment, output, employment, and incomes. However, in a world where the Doha Round multilateral trade negotiations have stalled and the commitment to multilateralism is waning, bilateral and regional trade agreements have increasingly been seen as a desirable second-best option, despite the negative impact of the spaghetti bowl effect, which not only leads to trade diversion, but also increases transaction costs. This is particularly challenging for small and poor countries with limited administrative capacity. The number of trade agreements increased from 50 in 1990 to 280 by 2017. RTAs that cover only tariffs and other border measures are shallow agreements, while RTAs that cover a larger set of policy issues are termed to be deep agreements. In many trade agreements today, negotiations cover multiple policy areas that affect trade and investment in goods and services, including behind-the-border regulation, such as competition policy, government procurement rules, and intellectual property rights. Deep trade agreements are important institutional frameworks for regional integration. They reduce trade costs and define many rules under which economies operate. If efficiently designed, they can improve policy cooperation across countries, thereby increasing international trade and investment, as well as boosting economic growth and social welfare. The World Bank Group has conducted some research which finds that on average, deeper agreements increase merchandise trade by more than 35%, services trade by more than 15%, and GVC integration by more than 10%. RTAs are currently at the center of many policy debates and are likely to shape trade and economic relations in the coming years. Some of these discussions are about reversing and renegotiating current arrangements, such as in the case of Brexit and NAFTA. Sri Lanka is currently renegotiating with India to expand the Indo-Lanka Free Trade Agreement in goods into a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement. In addition, as you know, Sri Lanka is also currently negotiating two further comprehensive FTAs with China, and of course, there is one in place with Singapore. Let me say a little bit about global value chains and the rise of global value chains. Side by side with growing bilateral and regional agreements, there has been a rapid growth in cross-border production sharing networks. The emergence of GVCs has offered developing countries opportunities to integrate into the global economy. The GVC-related trade has translated into significant economic growth in many countries over the last 2 decades, fueled by reductions in transportation and communication costs and declining trade barriers. More than 2/3 of world trade occurs through GVCs, in which production crosses at least one border, and typically more than one border before final assembly. China has been playing an increasingly important role as both a supply and demand hub in traditional trade and simple GVC networks. That's in trade, traditional trade and simple GVC networks, that is cross one border. However, the US and Germany are still the most important hubs in complex GVC networks, that is, networks which cross multiple borders. New technological developments such as robotics, cloud computing, big data, and Internet of Things are beginning to reshape and further transform GVCs. Small and medium-term enterprises are, however, underrepresented in GVCs, which seems rather counterintuitive, despite the fact that the digital economy provides new opportunities for SMEs to play a more active role. However, the full impact of new digital technologies on GVCs is yet to be seen. They could reduce the length of supply chains by encouraging the reshoring of manufacturing, thus reducing opportunities for developing countries to participate in GVCs. Or they could strengthen GVCs by reducing coordination and matching costs between buyers and suppliers. Despite the aggregate gains they create, automation and digital technologies can cause disruption and widen existing disparities across regions and individuals. This calls for broad and comprehensive adjustment policies. Open and transparent policies tend to promote GVC-led growth more than import-reducing policies targeted at raising the share of domestic value addition in exports. What about Brexit and its implications for Sri Lanka? The effects of Brexit will depend on the nature of the outcome of the process. However, one can conclude that lower investment in the UK is the most likely foreseeable scenario, and this would tend to reduce productive capacity over time with negative implications for growth, employment, and incomes, and naturally for trade as well. The UK is a major trading partner, accounting for 8.2% of exports and 1.7% of imports in 2018. The impact of Brexit will depend, as I said, on the outcome of the process, as well as the trade policy that the UK adopts in the aftermath of Brexit. It is true that the UK British High Commissioner to Sri Lanka in January 2019 is reported to have given assurance that the UK will extend the same preferential tariff rates to countries benefiting from GSP Plus to ensure that there would be minimal impact on Sri Lanka's exports in the post-Brexit period. Now, let me talk a little bit now about the implications for small and developing countries more generally. The developments in world trade have created both opportunities as well as threats for developing countries. In theory, the spread of GVCs should make it easier for small and developing countries to participate in trade, as the breakup of the production processes makes it feasible for a specialized firm to find niche markets. Yet, these countries are underrepresented in GVCs. Developing countries feel their development efforts are being constrained by the high prices charged for borrowed technology due to the international system of patents and the monopoly power held by some technologically innovative firms. However, there are also new opportunities. Cross-border e-commerce platforms are providing opportunities for small and developing countries. As access to information and communication technology continues to grow, there is evidence that internet reduces search costs, facilitating more exchange and increasing firm productivity. There is also evidence that trade tensions between the US and China have benefited several small developing countries through trade diversion. Of course, our apparel exporters have benefited to a degree. There's also the case of the small Pacific islands of Micronesia and Nauru, who have increased exports by 0.8 percentage points of GDP due to an increase in exports of electrical switches to the US and seafood to China, respectively. However, such gains in the short term may be overrun by risks in the medium term. The World Bank has estimated that losses occurring in all regions through escalation to a full-blown trade war and a loss in investor confidence could reduce global exports by up to 3% at a cost of USD 674 billion and reduce global income by up to 1.7% or USD 1.4 trillion. Roughly half of the global income loss, or 1.4 trillion, would be incurred by developing countries, excluding China. And a third of the global export decline of 674, that's what, about 225 billion, would be due to losses of developing countries. So trade tensions would depress trade, disrupt global supply chains, and divert trade away from developing countries. The bottom line is that short-term benefits for developing countries notwithstanding, there are no real winners in a trade war. Now, let me turn to Sri Lanka now and some of the challenges on the external trade front. As you all know, historically, the growth in Sri Lankan exports has been lackluster, while import expenditure has increased at a much faster pace. This is in contrast, of course, to the trade performance of the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia. Export-led growth has not taken place, as growth during the recent past has mainly been generated by domestic demand, spurred primarily by government spending. Interestingly, if you look at our growth pattern, it is strongly correlated to the size of the budget deficit. When the budget deficit is high, the growth goes high, the economy overheats, and then we have to clamp down, and these are a repeating cycle. We haven't really strengthened the growth framework through structural reforms. We haven't been able to drive growth through external demand, through exports and FDI. Exports as a percentage of GDP peaked in 2000 at 33.3% and gradually declined to 12.4% in 2016. Since then, it has been increasing very gradually, and exports recorded 3.4% of GDP in 2018. Now, what are the issues and bottlenecks in the export sector, in the external sector? One, lack of diversification and product complexity. Sri Lanka's largest three exports, garments, tea, and rubber, account for about 2/3 of our export receipts. The volume and complexity of the export basket needs to be increased. In 1980, if you mapped the exports of Sri Lanka and Thailand in terms of complexity, there was no difference. You map the exports of the two countries now, it's dramatic how much more complex Thailand's export basket has become. Three, reduced international competitiveness of Sri Lankan products owing to high costs of production, lack of labor, and complex import tariff structure. Electricity costs and the cost of production. We have ridiculously high electricity costs, all kinds of structural problems which can be resolved but somehow never do get resolved. The fourth problem is the existence of para-tariffs which impede access to global and regional supply chains. As you know, in modern production sharing networks, the distinction between exports and imports gets blurred. You bring something in, you do your little bit, and you send it out. Now, if you stick a para-tariff in the middle of that, you are uncompetitive, and which is why we have a negligible presence in the most dynamic component of the international trading system, which is the global supply chains, these cross-border production networks. We've had very little penetration, and the para-tariffs have been an important part of that negative story. Also, historically, the exchange rate was largely defended at the cost of depleting reserves. In the past, real effective exchange rates have remained above the 100 index point level due to an overvalued rupee. This has meant that foreign producers have been subsidized at the expense of local exporters and producers of import competing goods. This is what people often don't realize. When you have an overvalued currency, you are effectively subsidizing foreign producers at the expense of your exporters and producers of local import competing goods. Also, and you wonder why there is so much pressure to have an overvalued exchange rate, and that's because there are many more consumers than there are producers. We have a fairly high import component in our basic consumption basket, so the politicians come under pressure when when the currency is adjusted and costs go up. But when we have an uncompetitive exchange rate, we don't produce exports, we don't produce import competing goods, and we don't have a basis for sustained growth in our economy. So that's why we need to create these artificial highs to push our growth rate up, which only is for it's short-lived, and then of course we clamp down and it all comes down again. So we have to change this cycle and have the structural reforms that strengthen the growth framework, particularly the framework for exports and FDI. There is an anti-trade liberalization mindset among the public, policymakers, and professionals. This is one of the reasons why I said is that somehow we feel that the policies that are needed to promote exports are such that you have to have a competitive exchange rate, you have protection, essentially makes you uncompetitive. All these things, with our mindset of protecting and trying essentially to drive growth through inefficient import substitution, and also through development of the non-tradable sectors, is just not sustainable in an economy of 21 million people, or in any economy for that matter. In fact, this argument about whether or not integration is good, in my view, got resolved by looking at the experience of China. You look at the coastal regions in China, dramatic transformation. If you look at, and because that region is strongly integrated to the global economy. You look at the hinterland, that is way behind. Those areas are far less integrated. I think that just, if you just look at that scenario, that gives you, makes a compelling case why greater integration is desirable. Now, and of course, not only have we not performed very well on the export front, but we've also have not been anything like as successful as a number of Asian countries in attracting FDI. Though last year we did have a record, and we were heading for another record this year, but now the April events have disrupted that. But we know we are setting records from an extremely low base. There's much that needs to be done to increase FDI flows. Okay, so those are the problems and constraints. Now, have we done anything to try to address them? The answer is yes. There have been a number of policy measures taken to address issues and challenges in external trade. One, a new trade policy was introduced with the objective of attracting more export-oriented FDI, improving trade logistics, as well as increasing transparency and efficiency of customs procedures. The Trade Adjustment Program has been introduced with the objective of smoothing the transition of firms and workers to new liberalized market conditions. A Trade and Productivity Commission has been set up for this purpose, and I see Dr. Silva is a member of that. The National Export Strategy was launched by the EDB, providing a 5-year action-oriented framework for 2018 to 22, and they have made a very good start in terms of export performance over the last year or two. There are 6 focus sectors, namely ICT, business process management, wellness tourism, boat building, electronics and components, processed food and beverages, and spices and concentrates. In addition, priority has been attached to developing the following trade supporting functions, namely trade information and promotion, national quality infrastructure, logistics and warehousing, and innovation and entrepreneurship. There is also an innovation and entrepreneurship strategy that is being formulated with technical assistance from the World Bank. On top of that, an anti-dumping and countervailing law has been enacted. The National Trade Facilitation Committee has initiated activities to establish a national single window. I believe we are very close to finalizing that. And a trade information portal was launched by the Department of Commerce in 2018. On the central bank side, in line with the implementation of a flexible inflation targeting framework, the exchange rate is being managed flexibly. So the central bank does not defend any particular level for the exchange rate, nominal or real. What it does do, though, is to intervene in the FX market, in the foreign exchange market, if there is disorderly adjustment which is not aligned with the underlying fundamentals. But otherwise, we don't deplete our reserves to defend a particular rate. And right now, actually, the RIA is below 100. So the rupee is undervalued, which is favorable for exporters and producers of import substitutes. Now, para-tariffs on over 1,300 import items were removed in 2016 and 17. The budget 2019 proposed to continue phasing out para-tariffs over a 5-year period. As I said, this is what has really deprived us from participating in these cross-border production sharing networks, which have been the most dynamic contributor to international trade in the last couple of decades. So all these measures taken together should serve to address the bias in the policy framework which has constrained export expansion. What more could be done? I think a start has been made, but more can be done to diversify the export basket through vertical and horizontal integration. One of the things, interestingly, I've talked to a couple of ambassadors, and they've been taken up with the idea. We have the best cinnamon in the world, but we don't have a fragrance industry, a very high value production. I could never understand why we haven't got some of these leading brands to come and produce fragrances in this country, which is a very, very high value product indeed. Diversification of services exports with the support of new infrastructure and skilled labor. Service exports are vital in cushioning the deficit in the current account, as increasing merchandise exports cannot be implemented immediately. Therefore, it is imperative to exploit the full potential of low-hanging fruits in the services exports. Particularly, emphasis should be placed on the information, technology, and business process outsourcing sector, as well as tourism, of course. Manufacturing should not be ignored. Sometimes I've heard people say, well, we are a services economy, but that is not really so. If you're focused on components and plugging into supply chains, creating new industrial zones with FDI, there is the supply chains in Asia are undergoing a major reconfiguration because of the trade tensions. Vietnam, I think, is getting about 50% of that relocated investment. We have a chance, hopefully after the elections are over and we get our act together and we can capture some of that relocated investment. Now, export market diversification. In this area, priority should be attached to new markets in Asia, supported by trade agreements, while consolidating and building on the traditional markets in Europe and the US. Enhancing FDI through efficient business facilitation, investment promotion, and prompt availability of investment on investment opportunities are being given priority. On trade facilitation, I think a fully operational single electronic window would be very useful. In terms of a greater integration with the regional and global economy, trade agreements are crucial. Now, as you know, we are renegotiating the bilateral agreement in goods with India to extend it to cover services, investment, technology, training. A similar agreement is being negotiated with China. We have a partnership agreement with Singapore. We have a bilateral agreement in goods with Pakistan. We're also, I think, negotiating a partnership agreement with Thailand. But there is one thing here. If we are successful in completing the partnership agreement with China, we would be the only country in the world with preferential access to China, India, and the EU under GSP+. I'm not aware of any other country which has preferential access to these three markets. And you put that side by side with our location, 20 miles off India, and smack bang in the middle of China's maritime Silk Route, access to ASEAN and the Middle East, East Africa. It's, location plus these very preferential access to these three large markets and very good international relations with all the major players really puts us in an excellent position. The potential is enormous, but for that, we need to get a lot done in terms of the business climate, in terms of the investment promotion, trade facilitation, trade policy, the factor markets, high cost of electricity, all these problems. If we make headway, we have made a start. To be fair, we have made a start, but the progress is too slow. If we're able to press on, the potential of this country is enormous indeed. Thank you very much.